What was the first democracy in North America? I imagine your first instinct is to think the United States. Their republic was founded in the 18th century, and very often the way that Americans teach history, they think that they were the first democracy, or at least the first one since Greece. Though I imagine the more astute Step Back viewers will know that if I started with such a simple question, that there's probably something going on. And there is, viewer. There is. You might have heard of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's the name the people of the Confederacy prefer for themselves. Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. You might know them as the Six Nations, or the Iroquois. Our story today is about the legend of the founding of this League of Peace and the resilience and future of the nations within this great confederation. According to the oral tradition of the Haudenosaunee, we begin with an Onondaga man named Hiawatha. His story is very much a legend passed down by many generations of oral storytellers. He was likely a historical figure, but with lots of edits and flourishes over the centuries. He lived during a time in history known as the Time of the Blood Feuds. It was a violent period before the unification of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. Violence from one nation to another sparked retaliation, which would repeat in an endless cycle of bloodshed. Hiawatha's story begins with tragedy. As an Onondaga warrior, he lost his wife and daughters to the endless conflicts scarring the land. The loss sent him into a deep depression, and he wandered the land, mourning. In his travels, he met Daganoweda, the peacemaker. The Haudenosaunee portrayed Daganoweda as a wise wanderer from the far north. He came to this land with a mission to end the blood feuds and bring peace. The two men met somewhere in the Mohawk Nation's territory, a nomad who wanted to bring peace to a war-torn land, and a grieving husband and father in self-exile. They both wanted to see an end to the war and violence plaguing the people of the Longhouse. But Hiawatha was in a deep depression, the loss clouding his thinking, and he could barely keep himself together. If he were to move forward to save those people from the endless cycle of war, he'd need to process his grief. Daganoweda taught him an important ritual still held in sacred practice today by the Haudenosaunee. It's a ceremony of prayer and song, used as a way to process grief for the dead. This was meant to replace a practice known as mourning wars. These were wars not for resources or territory, but for revenge, a part of their spiritual healing process. The battles included capturing captives to become spiritual successors of those they'd lost. The ceremony was one of the first concrete steps towards peace, a way to put an end to violence met with retaliatory violence and endless blood feuds and mourning wars that just rampaged every society and left everyone full of grief and hatred. This was a way to heal the wounds between these groups, and for the first time in a long time, make peace. The ritual requires a practitioner of a calm mind, one unaffected by grief. They would clear the eyes of the mourner from the tears to clear their vision. They'd open their ears to help them hear clearly, and their throat so that they may speak. The cloud of pain and suffering would lift, and reason would return. If the Haudenosaunee nations were entire tribes in mourning, clouded by the grief of endless cycles of violence, then the role of Daganoweda would be as a clear-headed outsider who came to this land to perform this condolence ritual for an entire country. Daganoweda had healed Hiawatha, and soon Hiawatha became his follower. They traveled along the 5 original nations of the Confederacy to spread knowledge of the condolence ceremonies. They immortalized the condolence ritual within an intricate pattern of beads on strings known as wampum. To this day, the Haudenosaunee use wampum to remember their history, traditions, and laws. They trace the origin of this practice to this moment with Hiawatha. The pair's first stop was the Mohawk Nation. From there, they moved west, spreading the knowledge of the condolence ritual. The Mohawks accepted it as well as the Oneida Nation. Their third stop was Hiawatha's home nation, the Onondaga. There, they met with a war chieftain named Tadodaho. The legends say he had snakes for hair and wielded dark magic. If you don't choose to look at him literally, though, you could see Tadodaho as sort of a counterpoint to Hiawatha, both of them representing the two things that were creating the great pain and sickness of the Haudenosaunee people before the Confederation. Atotarho represents the resistance and the legacy of all of the anger and hatred that had been pent up through years of war. Atotarho was also a chief who owed his position of power to war. He was a war chieftain, and so many before the founding of the Confederacy held their positions of power based on being part of the warrior caste. To stop the endless cycle of war meant to give up some of their prestige and their position. So while Atotarho represented the anger and the vitriol and the violence, Hiawatha represented the pain and the loss. Both would need to be overcome in order to build this Confederacy of Peace. And so when the pair went to see Atotarho, he rejected their proposal. They did not let this rejection defeat their mission. Soon, Hiawatha and Deganawida met with the Cayuga and Seneca, who agreed to join. They returned to Atotarho with the four nations backing them. He still refused their offer. Unable to see past his own rage and hurt, the other four nations proposed attacking the Onondaga to force them into the Confederacy. But Hiawatha did not want a black mark on the birth of an era of peace. He offered Atotarho a sacred position, that of the Great Chief, or Chief Sachem. The Onondaga Nation would also become the home of the Grand Council. It would be the meeting spot for all of the nations to discuss Confederacy matters. And you know what? He agreed. The message of peace had gone through. From this moment, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was born. After Atotarho experienced his own condolence ceremony, he and Hiawatha were as brothers. The early Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a massive power in the region. Their ability to cultivate the three sisters of corn, squash, and beans led to a vast population. Hold on, I think I'm getting a collaboration thing. One sec.
Hi, I'm Cogito. You can tell it's someone from another channel because the art is, better? I've made a video in collaboration with Stepback on the amazing agricultural technology that the Native Americans possessed. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, then head over to my video once you finish watching this one.
With this superior population, they were able to expand into regions less populated. That is, until they got farming as well, and even the odds. I will mention though, these archaeological theories clash with the Haudenosaunee themselves who dispute this. Things seem to be going well until the 15th or 16th century. The Haudenosaunee began to face their greatest threat, a force which threatens their existence to this day. They met Europeans. Historians dispute whether their first interactions with Europeans was in 1535 meeting Jacques Cartier or in 1608 meeting Samuel de Champlain. Regardless, they soon became well known to the French. The French would forego calling them the Haudenosaunee, or the name of the nation they belonged to, opting for the name Iroquois. Contact was a disaster. The European diseases brought mass deaths to the Haudenosaunee people as well as every indigenous nation on the hemisphere. Estimates range from 80 to more than 90% of the population of North and South America. This mass dying represented about a fifth of the human population. In a never-ending drive to secure more hunting territory for beaver pelts, the Haudenosaunee launched a conflict against the French and their Huron allies known as the Beaver Wars. They purchased guns from their Dutch allies in modern-day Albany to fight back. Scholars now believe this conflict was a new emergence of the Morning Wars. They looked for people to bolster their population. Captives would become symbolic reincarnations of the many, many lost. Though they managed to dodge and even expand their territory, by the early 18th century the Haudenosaunee were a major power in North America. They could play the rival empires of the British and French against each other to their benefit. Displaced from their homes in North Carolina, the Tuscarora asked to join the Great Confederacy, and they became the Sixth Nation. Today, you might hear the Haudenosaunee referred to as the Six Nations. Other nations became subjects of the Confederacy in something called overlordship. The Confederacy assimilated them as part of the Covenant chain. They were essentially made tributaries. During the 7 Years' War, the Haudenosaunee allied with the British against the French. After the British victory, they signed a treaty ensuring them land to live upon which settlers could not expand into. Just want to mention though that many citizens of the 13 colonies both ignored this treaty and complained about it. Frustration over this curb on expansion, as well as many other issues from the 7 Years' War, prompted the 13 colonies to rise against the British in the American Revolution. The Haudenosaunee initially tried to keep neutral in the conflict. As the war dragged on, though, loyalties to the British or Americans split the Confederacy. They weren't able to recreate their great bonfire until after the war in Buffalo. But now, the nation straddled two separate countries. The Americans demanded through a series of treaties a majority of Haudenosaunee territory. The governor of New York tried to convince them to sell their land to white settlers, even exploiting an alcohol dependence epidemic to strong-arm them into giving up their ancestral territory. By the 1950s, the US was still confiscating land from the Confederacy. After World War II, the US began something they called Indian termination. They went through the act of trying to dismantle indigenous governments in favor of forced assimilation into American culture. They attempted to officially terminate relations on a nation-to-nation level. Nowadays in America, the legal status of indigenous people is a messy, oppressive patchwork of laws depending upon who could lobby for their existence. To this day, the Haudenosaunee government still exists. It still strives to keep a secure future for its people while resisting colonization. This is the crucial part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy I really want to impress. They're still alive. We tend to conceive of the stories of indigenous people as being past tense, on this long era of decline, on this inevitable path towards oblivion. But they are alive. They are current. They have not just a present, but a future. And it's a future that we can all do something to make better. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons, who, without which there would be no Step Back at this point. I would not be able to afford to do it. By the way, I'm very close to making Step Back my full-time job, which will mean more and better content for you. So if you want to be one of those fantastic people who want to step up and help Step Back succeed, who believe in its mission of improving historical literacy and combating reactionary abuses of the past, then please go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and give as little as $1 a month. It all actually really helps a ton. But I understand if you're not a commitment type and you want to give just a one-time gift, maybe there was a video you particularly liked, then please, you can go to paypal.me/stepbackhistory and give anything really will help. And if you're unable to, or you don't want to help monetarily, trust me, I completely understand. You could help out Step Back by sharing a video that you like with a family member, with friends, with a community that you belong to, online or offline. It would really help. Word of mouth is really the way that spreads Step Back, because I'll tell you from the backside, the algorithm does not like this channel. Of course, go and check out Kogito's video down in the description and come back soon for more Step Back.